This morning I want to spend time talking about Jesus and His model for us of community life. Jesus makes some very particular choices. Now I'm going to be very open with you about why. We are right at that time of year that we launch our small groups program. And small groups is one of the ministries of this church. I hope that by the time that I'm finished this morning, you see that for me anyway, small groups is more than just an ancillary ministry. It is more than a tack on to church life. It is, to my mind, it is church life. And I say that because of Jesus and His choices. Now, I don't say that to judge anybody who disagrees with me, and you can feel free to, and I would love to chat with you. But I'm telling you, this is what I see in the Lord Jesus Himself. Okay? So, Jesus, when he's talking to Peter one time, he says, "Who do people say that I am?" And they give him some options. Some people say you're Elijah, one of the prophets. And he says to the disciples, "Well, who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus makes that famous play on words. You're Peter, Petros, those two words, and I always get it mixed up which one's actually Peter's name, but they sound the same, right? You're Peter, and on this rock. The word rock is Petros, Peter, Petra, right? Am I getting that right? Anyway, you're Peter, and on this rock, I'm going to build my church, and the gates of hell won't prevail against it. That's what we're going to talk about this morning. The gates of hell being conquered by the church of Christ. You know, the gates are defensive measures. They hold people in, and they protect them from a war. When he says the gates of hell won't prevail, he doesn't mean the church will be able to stand against the assault. No, he has the view of the church as the army assaulting. The army on the attack, and hell is on the defensive. That's true where the church gathers. But when he says, "I will build my church," this is not what he means, okay? He's not talking about that. Can you see what that is? That's a construction project where he's building a building. People say, the word church doesn't mean building. Well, actually, yes, it does. The English word church comes from the German word Kirk. And Kirk means chapel. So, yeah, the word church means building. But the word ecclesia means people. The Greek word ecclesia, the reason church means people is because the Greek word that's translated to our English word church, that word might mean building, but the original Greek meant people. And it meant this: the gathered group of people gathered together. In Greek, ecclesia translates the English word, but the most direct translation would be more like assembly or gathering. It's actually a political word. It's not as though Jesus made up a word when he said, "I will build my church." No, he grabbed a word that would show up in Aristotle when he talks about the polis. And it's a gathering of people who get together to say, okay, how are we going to structure and organize our life? And the leader in the polis would be the leader of the assembly, or the leader of the ecclesia, and he would say, okay, maybe he runs it democratically, maybe he runs it autocratically, and says, this is how we're going to structure, and here's your role, and this is your role. It was about building a particular kind of life. That's what the assembly was for. They gathered together in assembly. Now, it's a political term. Interestingly, it doesn't tell you how many. So, sometimes the ecclesia might be 1,000 people. Sometimes the ecclesia might be a city council of 8. And they're both going to have the word ecclesia attached to them. Because what's being emphasized is it's about people getting together. That's church. Whenever we think of ecclesia, do you ever think of that? A little group of people gathered together. Very often when we think of small groups, we think of it in the terms that I've already introduced it in this sermon. It's a ministry of the church. That's off there. The church is here. We're the church right now. That's not church. You know, when we think of church, we think of this. A big group of people. The large group gathering. Well, now, listen, there are things that the large group does way better than most small groups. For instance, maybe you've got a small group that sings. Maybe. But could you do what we did here, you know, when Ethan got up here and can you do that? Well, some groups can, but a lot of groups forego singing because they don't like pain, you know. And so when they gather together, they know if we try this, we did it again. Well, no, let's not do that. Let's just go on to other things, right? But is that little group, I'm sorry, I meant to go backwards. How do I go back with this one? Like this? There we go. Is that little group a church? Well, if you're using the word ecclesia, then yeah, it is. It's a gathering of Christians who are gathering together for the purpose of being with Christ. This is Christ's church. If that's his. If that group is there and they're not studying, I mean, those I guess could be algebra books or something. But if they're studying to be with Christ, that's church just as much as this is. Have you ever thought of it that way? Small group is not some ancillary thing, it's church. Anytime you gather together with other Christians for the purpose of being with Christ, guess what you're in? Church. Our mind tends to go, well, it's this building, it's this place, it's these pews. And like I said, I'm not suggesting we give this up. Don't. The large group gathering is celebratory in a way that a smaller group is not. There are purposes that are accomplished here that are not as easily accomplished there. But also keep in mind that there are purposes accomplished there that are never accomplished here. And if we're going to storm hell's rusty gates, we're going to need to get small sometimes. There are times when we need the vulnerability and openness. And I'll tell you, if we're following the Master, He's left us an example. Now, He's left us an example of sociological realities. Frankly, if someone started talking right now while I'm doing this, you know, somebody just said, you know what, I don't know that I like small group. Would that be a little weird? I mean, that would be really awkward, wouldn't it? Large group gatherings are really more designed for one-direction communication. You know, you'll go talk about it afterwards, but right now it's kind of this way. And if it starts going the other way, it gets really weird really fast. Because the group that you're in tells you what norms are. What's normal, what's not. What is the correct behavior here versus there? Have you ever been in line at the bank or something, and you're there with a chatty Cathy, or verbose Victor, whatever, the person that turns around and suddenly is your best friend, and you're like, I don't know who you are. Can we just stand in line? Because the sociological reality of what we're supposed to do here is you're supposed to face that way, not this way. Turn around. I don't want to do this right now. Do you know that I have a headache? And I'm going through my shopping list. Just stop. That's because the social norms of that setting dictate that. Now, if you are a chatty Cathy or a verbose Victor, I apologize. And feel free to talk to me in public whenever you see me, but you know what I'm saying. That there are sociological expectations of certain settings and situations. We don't get real talky right here, but you better get talky in a small group, right? And if it's just one-on-one, and you're just sitting there, you're not accomplishing much church, are you? One-on-one settings are meant to be conversational. They're meant to be transparent and close. Right? What group you gather in when you do church has an effect on how you behave and how you're accepted. What's expected of you and what's acceptable for what you do. I believe Jesus knew this. And this is a reality that hides from us. But I'm going to suggest it's hiding in plain sight. Do you see the bug in that picture? Some of you do. If I do this, can you see it now? See, there are legs here, 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 and this is its body. That's not connected to that tree because it's not part of that tree. It's a walking stick. You ever see one of those critters? Funny looking things, aren't they? But when you see it in the picture, in the first picture, could you see it? When you first saw it, some of you could, but some of you could not. But you see it now, don't you? It's that kind of thing. It's hiding in plain sight. Or do you see the bug in that picture? Again, hiding in plain sight. Do you see it now? You see the moth here? Do I have a laser? Yeah, see that moth right there? You see it? But it's designed to hide on that flower. God made it to be able to hide like that. There are things that are just hidden in plain sight. That makes me giggle. Or, like the stars here. Have you seen those before? Incidentally, Blaine, I'm not suggesting we need to change the light bulb because I would be so sad if we lost my constellation. I really enjoy that. But anyway, and just in case you haven't, just in case you haven't seen the fox there, you see, and he says hattie, 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 ho. Anyway, this is one of those realities that hides like that. Jesus was very intentional about how he structured his life in terms of the relationships that he has. And Jesus has set us an example for how to structure our own lives and how to use our time in terms of relationships. The reality is all of us have a certain amount of time. And you choose how you use that time. Jesus chose to use his this way. And I think it's worth watching and seeing that this is what it looks like when a human being is fully alive. And these are the kind of relationships in which Jesus was engaged. So that we can see that and say, okay, well then in my own life, I also ought to follow my master in setting these relational priorities. Does that make sense? There is not overt commandment about this in Scripture that says you must be in a group of 12. It's not there. But if I'm going to look at his example and see this, I'm going to see that this is how Jesus made choices. And I believe that Jesus sets example for us. I believe that Jesus was remarkably successful in his faith life. That when you look at him, you see what a person who lives life well in relationship with God and man looks like. So these choices are worth seeing. Let's walk through these together. First, Jesus was part of a large group. You're in one of those right now. It's a group of about 100 plus. Once you hit 100, you really are in a large group and you can't pretend that you're in less than that. You really start hitting large group sociological realities at about the 35 mark. Now you can stretch it as far as anything under 100, but after you pass 100, you can't pretend anymore. You're in a large group. Okay? A large group is one that's generally focused on an event. It isn't about interaction. But the numbers matter. Have you ever gone to like a basketball game or something, and you're there in that basketball game, and the arena seats 60,000 people, and there's 300 of you? Doesn't it just feel dead? It just feels empty. And yet you go to that same arena, and it's got, 58,000 people in it, or 55,000 people, and now it's really comfortably full, and the game is better, isn't it? Because the number of people cheering for them affects what they experience, and it affects their performance. Plus, it's more exciting for you. And while you're not having face-to-face interaction with the dude next to you, unless he's like slobbery drunk and won't leave you alone, but you're not planning on talking to that dude, but you want him there. You want him there with you, cheering, because it has an effect on the event. That's what large groups are like. You come together, you have an event together. And while you don't focus on each other, you're really glad that each other are there. And you're really glad that all of this happens together while you experience this moment together. Jesus had those experiences. He tended to be the center of them. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. An event began, and all those people had a wonderful experience with Jesus as the center of it. Or then Jesus called his disciples and said, I have compassion on the crowd because they have been with me now for 3 days and have had nothing to eat. I'm unwilling to send them away hungry, lest they faint on the way. See, Jesus not only was the center of the event, but he cared about them. Both times, when Jesus is in a large group, all those people matter to him. Now, he doesn't interact with any of them one-on-one, though, does he? It's not a deeply intimate experience, but it's a deep experience with Jesus. Jesus still cares about large group gatherings. He wants us to have these, where you meet and you have an experience together. And it matters that the person's sitting next to you, even though you're not talking to them. And if you are, cut it out. I'm talking right now. I'm kidding. That was supposed to be funny. I didn't get a lot of sleep. Rotisserie sleeping. Okay, so anyway, that's the large group gathering. Does that make sense? You see Jesus doing that. All right, then Jesus has what we would call a mid-sized group, although it is admittedly a stretched one. It is expanded well beyond the normal boundaries of a mid-sized group. But I suspect Jesus accomplished with that group what mid-sized groups accomplish. What mid-sized groups are for is they're a little less event-oriented, but still significantly event-oriented. You gather together to focus on information. It's not just about the experience, it's about the information. You're gathering information, you're learning information. This is where indoctrination occurs in a holy way. Usually we use the word indoctrination pejoratively, like it's something horrible. Being centered into doctrine is a good thing. Too many Christians don't know or understand their faith. Gathering together in mid-sized groups enables that. You gather together and it gives you the room to ask a question. A mid-sized group has space for that, whereas a large group really doesn't. If you're gathering in a group of 1,000 people and you start asking questions, you're interrupting the event. But if you're in a mid-sized group and you have discussion, that's okay. It still focuses on the event, though, because if somebody stands up and has an emotional breakdown in a mid-sized group, what do? You take them out of the group. 2 or 3 people go with them to counsel that person and care for that person. The mid-sized group's not equipped to do it. You can shut down the group and disperse, or you can care for them outside of that group, but a mid-sized group won't do it. I think Jesus used the 72 that way. I think he taught them extensively. And why do I say that? Well, because of what their mission was. After this, the Lord appointed 72 others, and he sent them out ahead of him, 2 by 2, into every town and place where he himself was about to go. They were going out as his representatives to get those large crowds. To go and say, someone amazing is coming. You should hear what he taught me. Well, in order to be ready to go be his representatives, he had to spend some time with them, teaching them, getting them ready for this mission. So he used those 72 as a teaching place. And it was, I think, strictly focused on, here's the content of my gospel. Far more than it was, here's the content of my character. It was, here's what I intend to teach. I say that because character is far more easily revealed in the next level down, and all levels down after that. But there is room for this, right? Now, I'll tell you that in the American church, when we think of church, and we think about what church is, this is what we deal with. Everything above that line right there. The crowds and the 72. We think of large and mid-sized groups, and that's about it. That's where our focus is when we think of church. Small group might be some ancillary thing on the side, but we don't think of those as church. But go with me a little further, because Jesus does. Okay, and I did point this out. A mid-sized group, it can accomplish its goals, but as it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, it starts to lose that ability. Have you ever been in a group of about 50 to 70 or so, and you wanted to ask a question, but you were intimidated and you didn't want to do it because there's so many people in the room? So that's its losing. Whereas if you're in a group of 25, it's easy to ask a question. It's losing its mid-sized group abilities as it gets bigger. That happens to every group as they grow beyond their maximum. Every group starts to lose their ability to do what they could do when they were smaller. Okay? The next one, and this is the one we're really familiar with. And it's so amazing that we're so familiar with the 12, but then we pay so little attention to it. In terms of it guiding us and saying this is a principle for how to do church. Because how big was Jesus' church? 13. His main church was 13 people. He gathered together in that group. That was the group he focused on more than any other group, was the small group of just 12 other persons. The relationship, this is always relationship-oriented. Prove that from the Scripture. Well, I can't, except for from sociology. I know what that group's like. I know what a group of 12 people is like. That's where intimate questions get asked. That's where you can deal with this is what I'm struggling with, and you can share that with each other and pray with one another, and you come to know one's prayer requests in a far more intimate and detailed way because you hear them over and over and over again as long as that group is gathering. Do you realize that this is not a large group behavior, at least not the first time? The Lord's table was taken in a group of 12. Do you know that you can do that in small group and be biblical? In fact, it can provide for, instead of one person up here, because we do it like an event. And don't get me wrong, I think the way we do it's fine, it's fun, it's wonderful. But what if each of you shared what this meant? This is what it means to me this week. Whew, that would take on some power, wouldn't it? First time it ever happened, there was conversation going on. Some of it got written down. This was a small group event, folks, where you gather together. And Jesus was very purposeful about gathering that group together. It says, and he went up on the mountain and he called to him those whom he desired. Whom he desired. This was Jesus' choice to get small. You know, he could have done all his work in large groups. He wouldn't. He refused. He rejected that idea and he chose the small group. He selected these 12 and he appointed 12. And there's something amazing about that number 12. For one thing, it's theologically significant because how many tribes were there? 12 tribes. That's right. But for another reason, that starts to be the maximum of easy sharing. As you go beyond 12 people, sociologically, you begin to shift to a mid-sized group. 12 is kind of the top end, 12 to 16. Once you pass 16, you're not a small group anymore. You're a medium-sized group, just sociologically by the numbers. And what that means is the number of people who say, well, let's see, there'll be time for how many people to share? I better not. And people stop sharing at an intimate level once you pass 16 people. 12 is kind of the magical sweet spot because when you hit 12, you have a real community feel, but at the same time, the ease of sharing. And it's almost like the smartest man in the world picked that number. And there's something wonderful about this. And it comes to casting out demons. You're talking about storming the gates of hell. And they don't stand against the power of the 12. Do you know that when 12 Christians gather together, 6 couples, or 5 couples and 2 singles, when they gather together, power is there to share and to share what's really going on. You know that when people come forward in the large group event, they come and they get prayer and they get cared for. But how often do you really hear this is what's happening? And when you're in a small group of people, how often do you hear this is what's happening? Do you see the difference? And Jesus is just brilliant here, but he's not done. That's kind of, if a church is real advanced, it might have small groups. How many of them have micro groups? The micro group is 2 to 5. Now, frankly, I don't know that you can do this programmatically. I think when it comes to having a micro group, you need to get one. And you need to be doing it. You choose this. But what you've got here with Jesus in a micro group is it's typically used for crisis care and accountability. That's what, now, Jesus, I don't know that he needed it for accountability's sake, although, and he's a man, he's a human, perhaps he did. But I can't see him using it that way. What I see him using it for, he called together, you know his microgroup? Peter, James, and John. And if you look at his ministry, when his ministry is making a significant shift, they're there. Like this. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, and he led them up on the high mountain by themselves. He was transfigured before them, and his clothes became radiant, intensely white as no one on earth could bleach them. That's the transfiguration. That's a major shift in his ministry. He's letting the curtain slip and letting the disciples see, by the way, I'm more than just a man. This is a huge shift in Jesus' ministry. Or maybe this one, more famously, then Jesus went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray, and taking with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, that's James and John. He began to be sorrowful and troubled. Greatest crisis point of Jesus' life. And he pulls that group together to pray. Why does he do that? He needs their support. Even Jesus wanted someone to care about him and to care about the trouble he's going through. He left those other 9 over there, and he got this little group, and he says, I'm really troubled to the point of death. Sit here while I go pray, and pray for me. You know, that's a micro group. So you're sitting there, and all that money's in that account, and no one's watching it, and you know it. And you have those bills. And nobody would miss that 10 grand. Nobody would miss it. And you could probably put it back before there was ever an audit. And it'd be all right, and you could do it. You go to your microgroup and you say, I'm really, really struggling. And they know about your bill pressure because you've been asking them to pray for you, and they know about this temptation. And they say, yeah, somebody would know. I would know. And they say, and Jesus would know. Jesus wouldn't, don't do this. Don't break yourself. You see how hell's gates are getting crushed when Christians get together? And of course, there's even a further level of intimacy, the one-on-one friendship. And Jesus had that with John. And why do I say that? Well, because John writes about himself saying this, Peter saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. Now, wait a minute. Disciple whom Jesus, didn't he love all of them? Sure. But John wrote this. Do you think he could get away with saying this if there wasn't some sort of special relationship? I don't just suspect Peter would go, wait a minute, you love me too? No, everybody recognized there's something special between those 2 friends. See, Jesus lived in an intimate friendship where you can be completely transparent. And you need that. You need that kind of absolute transparency. You need to be able to be real. So many people live Christianly as though it were a belief system. Now look, it is a belief system, but it is so much more. It is a way of being human. And I'm suggesting to you that Jesus lived all these things and increasingly became intimate because that's what happens in smaller, more intimate gatherings. And I think Jesus is leaving for you a way of life. He is saying, this is how I lived, that's how you live. You choose these relationships too. You gather in the large group. You come to Bible class. So many Christians don't gather in a medium-sized group because that's a tack on and I don't really need there. Like if there's a season in your life where you can't make it for a Bible class, hey, fine. You know, we all go through seasons where it's rough. But if you blow off the medium-sized group, why? Have you really nothing left to learn? Is there nothing left to study? Are you breathing? There is always study to do. The medium-sized group is important. The small group is important. It's important to have that kind of intimacy. The micro group is significant. Building that kind of relationship with just a few people and that one-on-one Christian friend who will walk with you through life. Jesus left you that example. Now, what would your life be like if you followed it? If that crisis moment came, that really pretty girl comes knocking on your door, and she's been chasing you, that really wooing man who's super romantic and he's meeting your needs, your spouse is not, and you've got a group of people who knows you, that you can be clearly transparent with, and you can say, this is what I'm going through. Or that crisis with your money, or that crisis with your computer that you're keeping hidden, and nobody knows about it. We hide, and we keep ourselves locked in prisons of quietness, imprisoned with our sins that are eating us, where Jesus has said, let it out. Well, it's not safe to let it out here. Then go to where it is. Find someone who will love you no matter what, and you group with them, you gather with them, you go to church with them. You live the way that Jesus did, and you let that church smash at the gates of hell until they fall, and you walk out free. This is what Jesus modeled for us. This is how He chose to live His life. Do you see how I say it hides in plain sight? You can see it and not see it. How many of you knew those stars were even there? You've been coming, you've been seeing them, but they hide. You start ignoring them, don't? It's right there in plain sight. Jesus structuring His life this way. I think He's left for you an example to do the same. How would your life be if other people knew you? If other people knew what you were going through and were praying for you and were walking through the fire with you? How would life be if there was someone to lift your arms to keep the prayer going? How would life be if there was someone beside you to weep with you when your tears weren't shed and quiet and in the dark and you're on your own? What would life be like if you followed Jesus' example and you chose His church over isolation? There is great power in the church of Christ, strong enough to smash the gates of hell. Church, are you free? Are you free? If you look into your life this morning and you aren't doing any of this, and listen, incidentally, if you're not doing this through the ministry of the church, but you're doing it, praise God. You know, if you've got a group of ladies or a group of guys or a mixed group of people that you gather with regularly and you're living, great, good, keep doing that. Don't let me take that from you. You know, but if you don't have it, the church will help you. Gather with the church. And if you look into your life and you've got trouble going on that has absolutely nothing to do with what I've talked about, but okay, that's fine. It doesn't have to. Let us know, because the church wants to pray for you. At least let your micro group know, even if you don't let the large group know, huh? If this morning, though, you're subject to the invitation of God, why don't you come right now while we stand and sing?